I'm Edouard Machery, and I'm the director of the Center for Philosophy of Science. I'm also a distinguished professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. And my guest today is Professor Sandra Mitchell, Sandy Mitchell. Sandy, would you mind introducing yourself?
Thanks, Edouard. Yes, I'm a distinguished professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science as well. And I have been here at Pittsburgh since 2000. I was also actually received my PhD from this department, so it's home in many respects. My work has been in general philosophy of science, mostly concerned with the scientific explanations of complex behaviors and structures, often in biology, but also crossing into social science, into structural chemistry, and other domains as well.
So Sandy has published many articles. She has published several very important and influential books, but today I will just plug her most recent important publication in Theoria, which is the publication of the Lullius Lectures, and the title of the lecture is Landscape of Integrative Pluralism, which is one of the views she has developed over the years about the nature and structure of science. Maybe we'll come back to that question a little bit later. So today the main focus of our meeting is a place of values of science. And the reason we're talking about that is because the center will have a conference on that topic in 2 weeks from now, from April 5th to April 7th. It's called Revitalizing Science and Values. It's organized by the senior visiting fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Science, Arnon Levy. And Sandy has written a lot about science and values, and she will also give a talk at the April conference. So we thought it was a wonderful occasion to bring her to hear her thoughts on the matter. So to get us started, Sandy, there seems to be an increase in interest in the place of values in science. Could you tell us a little bit more about why you think people are so interested, and what are the main views, or what is the main view on the matter?
Yeah, I think that there's been a shift, especially since the late 20th century, into embracing a wider view of what we study when we study science. There's been a movement, especially when looking at the practices of science, to see that they're situated not just in the kind of epistemic enterprise of getting knowledge about nature, but they're also part of a social dynamic system populated by human beings who occupy different social locations in the societies, and that they are both part of and important for the functioning of a society. So I think by expanding the scope of what counts as science that's valuable for a philosophical analysis, it would be unavoidable to not consider not just the epistemic values that constitute the practices of science, but its location in social networks, as a source for information about policy and for individual decisions.
Good. So one follow-up question I suppose one might have is, it has been, I suppose, known for quite a long time that science belongs to society. And indeed, there are parts of the academic world which has been focusing on the location, the situatedness of science in society, namely sociology or sociology of science, the anthropology of science in the 1980s, with people like Latour, of course. What does philosophy have to say about the situatedness of science in society? One might worry, it's an interesting fact, but it's a sociological fact, not maybe of great philosophical relevance. I suppose if one wanted to push back against the idea.
No, that's great. Yeah, and I think so the explanation goes beyond just that it's situated, but that there was a really shift in what were the philosophical methods, not just the subject of science being expanded to include its social interactions, but also that what we count as science and how we study it shifted from a kind of externalist logical reconstruction, which we inherited, of course, from the logical empiricists, and which was a very powerful set of methods for understanding explanation and prediction and theories, and they were all reflected in a set of logical relationships. And as we know, logical relationships are the most abstracted away from kind of human reasoning. They're the most abstract formal way of representing that. And so the place for the role of values in the decision-making gets stripped out from those kinds of ways of representing scientific reasoning. And so when you think about evidence or confirmation, those were all logical relationships. And then, of course, Hempel introduced the notion of inductive risk, right, in that framework. So you start with the framework of here's how we do it logically. You hope for deduction because that gives you certainty. You can't have deduction. You move to induction, statistical reasoning, and all these still formal ways of representing reasoning. And by doing that, you have to bring back in the things that actually are motivating decision-making by human beings who are scientists or policymakers or citizens. And so I think what happened is that so the practice turn did more than just say we should look beyond the scope of language or the scope of logic, but it introduced new kinds of methods for trying to understand science besides the kind of logical reconstruction of the reasoning. And so the big debate, the inductive risk debate, kind of motivated both the 1950s, 60s discussion as well as the more modern discussion of the role of non-epistemic values in science, because it said if we start with logic, we're missing something. And that was the way I think that it gets motivated. But I think since that time, there's been the attempt to use these other kinds of tools, like what kinds of conceptual analyses are involved in generating claims, what counts as good evidence that recognizes the biases that might be involved in collecting evidence. So it's not just representing evidence as by E or O, right? Now you're looking at it in a much thicker kind of conceptual and inferential way. And so I think that's only part of why science and values issues have become more prominent. And of course, then there is the fact that philosophy of science is also situated in society. And we have been in and continue to be in a climate in which science has been challenged, the authority of science has been challenged, trust in science seems to be questionable. And so philosophers, I think, have a real opportunity and responsibility to address those issues. We study just those questions. Under what conditions should you trust science? What kinds of evidence are important for making decisions about how we act? How does that information generated in a scientific context, and how does that then get translated or implemented in social contexts like policy or individual decision-making?
So it's interesting that you started with the famous argument from inductive risk, which is indeed the place now 70 years ago or 60 years ago where, in philosophy of science, where values were first mentioned. I assume. I might be wrong about the history, but at least the reconstruction of the history of philosophy of science suggests that this is one of the most important moments where values get to be discussed. But it is in the context of confirmation, how evidence confirms theories. So it's a narrow context. Now, what you've been describing, in fact, suggests that values have a much broader context, and that philosophers should be interested in the role of values, not only just for confirmation, but in a much broader array of scientific practices or situations where science matters. Could you just give us some concrete examples of this kind of places where values do matter and should matter or must matter?
Well, there's a kind of simple and somewhat obvious place, which is in science policy, because policy making, even in its kind of formal representation, is a place where you need to make judgments that are based both on predictions of fact of what's going to happen and that are then modified by the values that you want to promote. Okay, so any kind of expected utility reasoning in cost-benefit analysis. These are the structures, at least, that are embedded in the United States government officially as required for any policy decision. You have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And to do that, you need to incorporate both information about the facts of the matter and the consequences that are possible as a result of various policy options, right? Should we mandate masks for COVID? Should we create carbon exchanges for climate change? These are things that require us to know what would happen if we did it, right? And why would we rather do one rather than another policy? And those have to reflect values as well. Now, I think one of the issues, and this is going a little bit beyond your question, is that some contemporary discussions of the role of values in science want to take the object of analysis all the way through the policy making. So it's not just the getting of the factual knowledge, if you like, but it's the implementing of it too, and putting that into the frame of responsibility for scientists. And I think Heather Douglas's work does this, for example, and she's contributed quite a lot to structuring the contemporary discussion of science and values. So if you think that scientists have to, in their doing of science, not just consider what's epistemically, factually, data-driven relevant for supporting our best understanding of some system like global climate change or the spread of viruses, right? If you think that's they're responsible to also to think about what are the social consequences of defending one view or another, right? Then it strikes me that for me that's that prevents us from having really clear notions of what how to solve problems in this domain. This kind of blurring of the boundaries of science, and therefore, and also meaning that yes, of course, science is imbued everywhere with social non-epistemic values. By saying that, I think, and making that all part of science, I think it restricts our ability to have a kind of critical discourse about what's the problem when we end up with a policy that we think is wrong, right?
So let me follow up on that. It's really interesting. Do I get you right that you think that while, of course, values are going to be part of the process of science in various ways, they might influence, sometimes in a wrong manner, the process of science, they must and should influence decision-making, obviously, and there's an interesting interaction between what scientists do, the information they're able to gather, and the values represented in the society and in policy decision-making. So that's all fine, but you disagree with the claim that scientists in the process of collecting evidence, running experiments, making observations, deciding which theories is best supported, should consider the social consequences of their views. So is that something you want to reject, or?
It's a little bit more complicated than that. So let me spell out a little bit more what I have in mind. And the question is what kinds of how do we understand the role? It's clear that human beings bring into the field study or their laboratories all sorts of features of their life that are socially structured, right? There's gender relations, there's race relations, there's class relations. These are all part of the individuals who are the actors in this scientific practice, right? But I think it's important to have analytical distinctions. So I don't want to say, scientists aren't human and therefore don't have political views or religious views or whatever views they have, but rather that to look at the obligations that scientists have with respect to their role as scientists. So any individual occupies many different institutional and social roles, right? You're a teacher, you're a father, you're a Republican, whatever you are, you're a citizen, you're a scientist, and each of these kinds of social institutions or practices carry with them sets of norms qua that practice, right? So the norms of being a scientist, strike me, should be articulated not that they're not that the practices are value-free, but the institutional norms that govern those practices are distinct from the practices of being a citizen or the practices of being a parent. And that when we as individuals make decisions about what to do, right, all of those different social roles come together. And so, yes, we should, when we're doing experiments, we know the obligation as a scientist is to try to get the best evidence we can to discriminate against competing hypotheses. We do, but we're not just we're not just scientists. We're also have moral obligations to not harm living things that can pick your favorite theory, feel pain, have reason, have sense, whatever you think. But so those interact. But I think that they interact because we are occupying two roles at the same time, not because science has to take on the obligations and the norms of these other social practices. So it's an analytic distinction embedded in the complexity of individual decision-making and other kinds of decision-making.
Good, that's very clear. I suppose one way to push back against that view is to say that the scientist, qua-scientist, to quote a famous title, must appeal to values at some parts of the process. And this is kind of argument that a few people have tried to put forward. I mean, the argument from inductive risk aims at arguing that to decide what to conclude based on evidence, you must set a threshold to have enough evidence. And how to set that threshold? They claim, the argument claims anyway, that you must appeal to non-epistemic values. Other people have argued that because we have so many possible models, we need to choose among models, and there's no other way to choose among models, qua-scientists, but maybe that's what you're going to be rejected, than to look at non-epistemic values.
Yeah, and I guess I just want some more conceptual space to understand those decisions rather than saying it's part of my scientific obligations to incorporate those values. So I think you can make, and this is the way I used to make this distinction between the domain of belief and the domain of action. When you want to act, yes, of course we act all the time without having certain beliefs about what's going to happen, and you want to act on the best of your knowledge. But our actions are also beyond the epistemic, right? We want to act not just on the best knowledge we have based on that, but also in a way that's morally acceptable, in a way that promotes maybe our political agendas of democracy as opposed to authoritarian structures. We might want to act in a way that preserves the planet for future generations. There's all sorts of things that when we're choosing how to act, that have to be involved in that decision. But I think you can think about the scientific contribution, and some of the things we do in science are actions. So when you do an experiment, you have to think about the consequences of the experiment, about the privacy of the information about the participants, about the effects on what's required, right? You have to make those kinds of decisions, and they're not always easy decisions. So we saw during COVID, for example, that challenge experiments were allowed where we would infect somebody and then give them the vaccine. We typically don't do those, but certain social circumstances and under some forms of respect for individual freedom to choose to participate, those things can be done. But those are complicated decisions. And those are decisions that reflect the kinds, not just the scientific demands, but the social, moral, political, et cetera, demands. So my view is that because scientific practice, once you move to practice, it's not just beliefs. Those kinds of interactions between the norms of different kinds of social practices are engaged, right? Right, they're turned on. Now you have to think about them. But the way to think about them, in my view, is to understand where those obligations come from. And for me, they don't all come from science.
Good. This is really, really helpful. One question, of course, one might want to have, particularly if I were a scientist, is supposing you're right that as a scientist, as a citizen, as a human being, I have various requirements, various norms that apply to my behavior and my formation of beliefs, maybe, but at least my behavior. And of course, these norms don't always go in the same direction. And as a scientist, I might want to run an experiment that will harm living creatures, from human beings, but also sometimes just animals. I might have to do some invasive procedures on monkeys and rats and mice and other creatures. As an individual, I might think it's wrong. As a member of society, I might think it's for the greater good. Do you have any advice about, or do you think we can give as philosophers maybe an advice about how to negotiate these possible conflicts between the various requirements any scientist is confronted with during his work or her work, or whether it is hard to say?
I think those are really complicated and difficult decisions, but we make them. We make them all the time. We make them about challenge experiments during COVID. We make them about changing the direction of science during great social and political need, like in the Manhattan Project, right? But we could also make them for other reasons, which I think, if you want, from my perspective, I would want to challenge. For example, pharmaceutical companies make them on the basis of profit motives, and the question is, well, how do we balance the values of supporting the shareholders of your company by creating pharmaceuticals and then selling more and more and more of them, and protecting, because this is now the intersection of a healthcare industry, which is supposed to be about caring for health, and a company in a capitalist structure, which is supposed to be caring about profits. And so I think my suggestion isn't to give an answer, but by locating what the norms are, gives us some purchase on where to identify where the problems are from. So in the oxycodone problem, for example, it wasn't that we needed to do more science. Okay, sometimes you need to do more science. We just don't know enough about how the system works to know what to do, right? To know that this isn't the right thing to do. Sometimes you need to do other things, like challenge the kinds of motivations and strategies that are ignoring the moral values, right, or even legal values that are being engaged in that kind of decision. So I think what I'm interested in is not so much what the answers are, but how do we put ourselves in a position to identify what the problem is when there is a problem. Is it a problem with the ignorance of the moral values that should be governing human interactions in an economy, or is it the problem that our science hasn't looked in the right place for the data, right? They've excluded through bias or whatever some source of evidence that would be relevant to knowing what the effects of this activity, taking these drugs, would be. And so a lot of the decisions, for example, about animal experimentation have to do with can we do this a different way? And that's how you manage, value conflict and value diversity, right? How can we do this to try to satisfy the values in the best way we can? And those are going to be contextually different.
Good. I have two questions, because you are actually reaching towards the end of this meeting. The first one is a follow-up, and I'd like to know what you think about that. Some people have thought that there are questions, types of research that we ought not to do. Research on race, for example, or research involving animal experimentation, that we should shut down much of what we do right now. Do you think that's a position that's defensible? It's a bit of an abstract question. You might use a joker card if you don't want to answer.
No, I do want to answer. Do we have enough time? So for me, it's based on a really, again, an impoverished framework, by suggesting that just knowing something determines how we act. I mean, that's just clearly not how this works, right? And that, in fact, if you want to preserve life, you want to get rid of racial discrimination, you need to know what the effects of it are and where you can intervene in that system to change the structure so that, say, health disparities by race are removed. Where do you go? Do you just go to the individuals of different races and say, okay, well, we just need to give you more of this medicine? Or do you go to the social structures that are generating the kinds of systemic locations for those kinds of health disparities? So unless we know what they are, you can't change them in the direction that your values push you. So I don't think that there are questions in science that should not be studied. There are ways of studying things that should not be done, right? That devalue things that we value, like human life or maybe the pain of sentient beings. And so those are things we shouldn't do, but we should still try to understand how natural and social and psychological systems work so that we can achieve our own goals in an efficient and effective manner. And if you don't do that, then I think everything just becomes, what do I want to see happen, and not how do I effectively make what I want to see happen.
Thanks. Last question is actually moving a little bit to, outside the context of science and values, but I would like to know whether you've written a lot about the nature of science, about its structure, about many aspects or many questions in philosophy of science. Does the topic of science and values connect to this broader interest of yours, or is it just a very narrow question that's somewhat disconnected from what else you've been working on?
Thank you for that question. I think it all connects. The approach I've been taking in my research in philosophy of science is to really appreciate diversity, and diversity in every aspect of science, and to understand that's why I defended not just pluralism in scientific explanations, that we have lots of different explanations, and shouldn't we just have one, the correct one? And the answer to that is no. That scientific investigations are perspectival. Pluralism actually increases our accuracy of knowledge about nature rather than decreases it, because not all different explanations compete with each other, that we only have partial grasps on what's going on, especially in complex structures, and that we need them all. Okay. So that raises the new question, though, once you embrace pluralism and perspectivalism, about how do we use them together. And this is the same structure of story with science and values. We recognize we have a number of different social practices that we engage in order to make our way through our lives. How do those sometimes raise different norms and values that we're trying to satisfy? How do we put them together? So it is another story of integration rather than a story of this is the one way that we should think about the role of values. Well, it's just going to depend. It's going to depend on circumstances. It's going to depend on available alternatives. It's going to depend on a lot of things, what specific decisions we make. But recognizing that there's not just one way. That kind of pluralism that I've been defending is a rejection of the kind of one way of doing things. The other aspect of my work is pragmatism, and coupled with a kind of interactionist view, that how we think about what science is changes over time. How we think about nature itself changes over time, that there's going to be this ongoing iterative process of negotiating what values should be implemented in any decision we make, about what our model of scientific, our scientific model of what nature's like. These things are changing all the time, and so I think what I see in the domain of science and values is that same kind of pluralistic, integrative, dynamic structure.
Thank you very much, Sandy. thanks for listening to our podcast, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you, Edouard.